So cells are the basic unit of life. We talked about that. And so all living things are made of cells. We're going to be looking at a couple different types of cells, probably early next week. We'll see all. These are some animal cells, probably cheek cells. These are LODS cells. These are onion cells. We'll be looking at all of those in the microscope. But when we look at these pictures, each sort of box or each circle is one individual cell. So we're going to start off today with a couple slides here about sort of the history of cells and the basics of cell theory, and then we'll move into the actual parts of cells. So when I ask this question, what are cells? You guys are on the right track. We say that they're the basic unit of life. The basic unit of life.
How do you pronounce that?
We'll get there in a second. So where would you find cells?
In your body?
Patrick? Okay.
In living organisms?
Yeah, in all living things. So we know that all living organisms are made of cells. So if you look at any living thing, whether it's a mushroom or a bacteria or a person or a tree, if you look at them, they are all made of cells. And this is something scientists started to notice, in the 1600s, that no matter what type of living thing it was, when we looked at it, it's made of cells. Now, what was important? What had to be invented before scientists could really look into this? Right? Yeah, the microscope. It wasn't until microscopes were invented that people could actually see cells and start to really think about them. Now, what was the main thing that had to be refined before microscopes were invented? Sure? Well, this is related to both of those. Okay?
The magnet, the eyeglass magnet?
Yeah, the lens. So lenses were the development. And a lens is basically just a piece of glass that's shaped in a certain way that it can magnify an image. And so scientists first started sort of working with microscopes in the 1500s and sort of working on lenses, and they really became much better in the 1600s and much more useful. The person that is often credited with the first person to see cells, and he was the person that gave cells their name, was Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke was doing his work in the 1600s, in the middle of 1600s. And he looked at, one of the main things he looked at was cork. What is cork?
It's like this thing that you find in wine bottles. And
So some wine bottles have a little, the seal is made of cork. Where else might you see cork, Joe?
in your hand.
Okay, yeah. What else?
In the ocean.
Okay. Yeah, this cork board. The material, this sort of soft, spongy material that you can put the pins in, that's made of cork as well. Cork comes from what? It's a wood. It's a type of plant. Okay, and this is sort of the bark. It has this sort of very low density, kind of soft bark. You can pass it around. That's a big chunk of cork.
Where are the cork trees?
I think they're a tropical tree. And so Robert Hooke took pieces of cork like that. He made thin slices and looked at them under the microscope. And when he did that, what he saw was that the cork is made of a whole series of small little boxes. So he called these small boxes, these are his drawings from his notebook. Now you see this is the chunk of cork, and if you look closely, it has all these little rectangles inside of it that he called cells. Can you guess where he got the name cells? He was the person that called these things cells. Have you heard that word anywhere else?
Yeah.
Yeah, jail cells. He wasn't specifically thinking about jail cells, but in a monastery where monks lived, they lived in these small little square rooms that were called cells. And so he said these parts of the cork looked like these square little rooms, and he started to call them cells.
I have a question. So is like billion peanuts made out of cork? Because it feels like those little peanuts.
Oh, like packing?
No, not those. Like they're like colorful and you, like little kids use for art.
I don't know.
What?
I'm not sure. All right. After that, Anton van Leeuwenhoek was another scientist. You have a question?
Yeah, like you know how like
Shh.
they use like the salads in like a shape. How do they make like you see how like or not the salad, the cork?
Yeah.
It's like a shape. How do
It's
they
like carved into that shape.
Oh, okay.
So Anton van Leeuwenhoek, he was actually the first scientist that saw living cells. The cells that Robert Hooke was looking at, the cells, that you're holding in that cork, they're dead cells. They're no longer part of the living organism. Leeuwenhoek saw living cells, though. He looked at a wide variety of living things. Pond water. And he saw, if you take a sample of water from a pond, you look at it in a microscope, you'll see that there's lots of little living organisms in there, single-celled creatures. He looked at blood and saw that blood is not just like a red liquid, it's actually made of small little parts that are cells. He looked at plaque, the gunk between people's teeth, and he saw bacteria living in that. And so he saw all of these things, and that allowed him to further expand on what Robert Hooke saw. And as microscopes became better and better, people were able to see smaller and smaller cells, see them in a wider range of living organisms, and they started to develop ideas that we now call the cell theory. Cell theory is an overall theory of science. Oh, what type of cells are these? Yeah, those are red blood cells. And Anton van Leeuwenhoek saw some of these red blood cells. So the cell theory, we say, has three main parts. So cell theory tells us, first of all life, all living organisms are made up of one or more cells. All living things are made up of one or more cells. That's the first part. The second part of the cell theory tells us cells are the simplest, smallest form of life. So there are some living things that are just a single cell.
How do they move?
Depends. Some of them have a flagellum, a tail. Some have cilia for swimming. Some ooze along on pseudopods. Some don't move at all. So it just depends on what type of organism it is. And then the third part of the cell theory tells us about where cells come from. Where do cells come from?
Atoms.
Not quite. Anybody else? No? Think about when we were exploring spontaneous generation. The overall conclusion was what? Okay?
Life can only come from life.
And yes, and therefore cells come from other cells. Cells only come from other cells. One cell can reproduce, forming new cells, and that's where cells come from.
I think isn't it different that like if a bacteria has a cell and if we have a cell, aren't the cells different sizes?
Yep, they're different sizes. And different cells, so sometimes people think that, well, a cell looks like one thing and every cell looks like that, but that's not at all true. For example, in our body, a red blood cell is that sort of red disc-like shape. A nerve cell has a big sort of blobby part and a long kind of tail thing. Skin cells look like little sort of ovals. Different cells in different parts of our body all look different. They're all cells, but they each have their own structure, way that they're put together, and their own function, their own job to do. So all cells are not identical. There's lots of different types of cells.
Was it from variation or mutation?
That the cells are different? No, well, this is a little beyond what we need to talk about. But every cell in your body, whether it's a nerve cell, a skin cell, a brain cell, they all have the exact same DNA. Okay? So then why are they all different from each other? Well, some of that DNA is turned on in certain cells, and in a different cell, another section is turned on. So they have the same DNA, but only certain genes are turned on or off.
This is confusing.
Well, that's more advanced than we really need to talk about. Correct? All right, the last thing is that cells contain parts within them. So we have a cell, which is just one sort of structure, but inside of it there are smaller parts. They're called organelles. Now, that word probably looks familiar. What does it look like? Organ. So what's an organ in our body, for example?
Heart.
Our heart,
Skin.
liver, lungs, skin, brain. So how would you define an organ?
Things that keep you alive.
Okay. Parts within us that keep us alive. Can you guess what an organelle is then? Want to try and give me the definition, Patrick?
Like an organ that has cells inside of it.
Not quite. You kind of flip-flopped it a little bit. Maggie?
A cell with those inside of it.
Yeah, there are parts within a cell that have a job to do, that keep the cell alive. That's what organelles are. They're like organs in a human, but they're organelles and they're in a cell. They have a job to do.
Mr. Burles, how is there more than one thing in a single cell?
They just are. I don't know what you mean. How? They're small and they're smaller than a cell. So, an organelle is a part of a cell with a certain job to do, a special function.
Wait, would the first one go there, or are we still going on?
Underneath, right underneath where it's at. Okay, and so we're going to spend a lot of time, after we watch this video, we're going to spend the rest of today and probably a lot of tomorrow talking about some of these organelles, these parts within cells, and talking about what they do, what their job is.